My name is Vivienne Aldcroft, and I was 52 years old the afternoon an estate attorney I had never met sat across from me in a conference room that smelled like leather and old money and told me, in the measured tone of a man accustomed to delivering bad news to well-dressed women, that my husband of 24 years had changed his will 11 days before he died. 11 days. I want you to hold that number for a moment the way I had to hold it, not as a fact yet, but as a weight, the kind that doesn't settle until you understand what it cost you. 11 days before the end, when Edward could no longer climb the stairs of the house we had built together and needed help to sign his own name, someone had put a new document in front of him. Someone he trusted. Someone I had trusted. And the estate that I had spent 24 years beside him building, the Aldcroft house on Beacon Hill, the lake property in Vermont, the portfolio that his family had always called the foundation, had been redirected, quietly and completely, away from me. Not to a stranger. That would have been cleaner. It was redirected to his son from his first marriage. A man named Griffin, who had spent most of those 24 years treating me like a pleasant inconvenience, and who had, apparently, spent the last 11 days of his father's life sitting at his bedside with a pen. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. If you have ever loved someone through their dying and then discovered that the dying had been used against you, this story is for you. Stay with me, because this one is about what happens when a woman who is taught to be graceful decides, quietly and completely, to be right instead. I want to tell you who Edward was before I tell you what happened to his will, because a man is more than what he leaves behind, and Edward Aldcroft was a great deal more. He was 58 when I met him, a Boston-born architect whose firm had spent 4 decades putting its mark on the New England coastline. He was silver-haired and exacting and funny in the dry way of people who have read too much to find ordinary things amusing. He had been married once before, briefly and unhappily, in his 30s, to a woman named Catherine who had left him and taken their son, Griffin, to New York, where Griffin had grown up largely without his father and developed, as fatherless boys sometimes do, a particular resentment of the things he had missed. Edward and I met at a Preservation Society dinner in 1999. I was 28, a junior archivist at a historical society, and I had absolutely no business being there except that my director had been ill and handed me her invitation. Edward was the keynote speaker. He talked about buildings as memory, the way a well-made structure holds the people who lived inside it long after they are gone. I had asked him a question afterward, a real question, and he had looked at me the way people do when they are surprised to be challenged, and 2 hours later we were still talking in the parking lot in the November cold. We married 3 years later. I was 31. He was 60. We both understood the arithmetic and chose each other anyway. The Aldcroft estate was the house his grandfather had built on Beacon Hill in 1922, a federal-style townhouse with original plasterwork and a garden that took 20 years to get right. There was also a lake house in Vermont that Edward had renovated himself, board by board, the way architects sometimes need to build with their own hands to remember why they started. And there were investments, a portfolio his family had grown across 3 generations, managed by a firm in Post Office Square that had handled Aldcroft money since before Edward was born. I had not come to the marriage for any of it. I want to say that plainly because Griffin spent 24 years implying otherwise, the way people do when they have decided the story before the evidence comes in. I came for Edward. I stayed for Edward. I sat with Edward through 2 cancer diagnoses, a hip replacement, a year of chemotherapy, and the long, slow unraveling of a mind that had once held the precise measurements of 1,000 buildings. And I did it because he was my husband and I loved him, and that is not a complicated thing. But love, as I have learned, does not make you immune to what happens in a room when you are not in it. Edward's second cancer diagnosis came in the spring of his 82nd year. Pancreatic. The kind that does not negotiate. His oncologist was honest with us in September, and Edward, being Edward, received the information with the same precision he gave to load-bearing walls. He understood exactly what it meant and began, methodically, to put his affairs in order. We had a will. We had always had a will, updated periodically over the years by our attorney, a careful man named Harold Birch who had handled Edward's estate documents since the 1980s. The most recent version, signed 4 years prior, left the Beacon Hill house and the Vermont property to me outright, with the investment portfolio split equally between me and Griffin, and specific bequests to several preservation organizations Edward had cared about for decades. It was fair. It was considered. It was, above all, something Edward and I had discussed together at a kitchen table with Harold and 2 cups of coffee, the way adults make decisions about the things they have built. Griffin had objected to it, of course. Not openly. Griffin was too composed for open objection, but in the particular sidelong way of a man who believes his birthright has been diluted. He had made comments over the years. At dinners, at holidays, in the careful asides of someone who wants you to know what he thinks without being accountable for having said it. Edward had heard them. Edward had not changed his will. Then October came and Edward could no longer manage the stairs. We moved him to the ground floor bedroom, the one that looked out over the garden. I hired a day nurse, a steady woman named Margaret, who came at 7 and left at 3. I was there the rest of the time. Griffin began visiting more frequently in those final weeks, which I understood as grief and welcomed, because whatever else Griffin was, he was Edward's son and Edward loved him, and a man should have his son at his dying. I trusted Griffin in that room with his father. That is the sentence I have had to live with. Edward died on a Tuesday in November, in the ground floor bedroom, with the garden outside the window and my hand in his. Margaret was in the kitchen. Griffin had left an hour before. The end was quiet, which is what Edward had wanted, and I sat with him for a long time after, the way you do when you are not ready to let the room become past tense. The call from Harold Birch came 10 days later. He asked if I could come to his office. His voice had the careful neutrality of a man who has something difficult to say and is choosing the setting deliberately. I sat across from Harold in his conference room, and he slid a document across the table and told me that a new will had been filed with the probate court. Executed, he said, 11 days before Edward's death. Witnessed by Griffin and a woman named Sylvia Prentice, whom Harold identified as Griffin's personal attorney. I looked at the document. Edward's signature was at the bottom, shaky and elongated in the way of a man whose hands were no longer reliable. It did not look like the signature on our joint tax returns. It did not look like the signature on the renovation permits for the Vermont house, which I had filed myself and handled myself and which I had pulled out of my own files the night before this meeting because some part of me, some quiet, careful part, had already begun to suspect. I asked Harold what the new will said. He told me. The Beacon Hill house went to Griffin. The Vermont property went to Griffin. The investment portfolio went entirely to Griffin, with a small bequest to one of the preservation organizations and a single line for me, the personal contents of the Beacon Hill house, my jewelry, my books, my clothes, and a sum of $200,000 described in the document as in recognition of her years of companionship. Companionship. 24 years. 2 cancer diagnoses. 1,000 nights in that house. And the word they had chosen was companionship. I folded my hands on the table and looked at Harold and asked him, in the steadiest voice I had, whether he had prepared this document. He had not. He had known nothing of it until Griffin's attorney filed it with the court. Harold had been Edward's attorney for 40 years, and he had not been consulted, not been notified, not been given the opportunity to ensure that the man signing the document understood what he was signing. Harold looked at me across the table with the expression of a man who is angry and cannot show it professionally. He said, "Vivienne, I think you should get your own attorney." I did not cry in Harold's office. I have thought about that since, why I didn't, and I think it is because the grief and the fury arrived at exactly the same moment and canceled each other into something cold and clear. The feeling was not devastation. It was recognition. The slow, terrible recognition of a woman who realizes she has been outmaneuvered in a room she didn't know was a game. I drove home to the Beacon Hill house. I walked through every room. I stood in the ground floor bedroom where Edward had died, and I looked at the garden and I thought about 24 years of small decisions, the plasterwork he had restored by hand, the garden beds we had planned together on graph paper at the kitchen table, the Vermont house where we had spent every August for 2 decades, and I understood that all of it had been reclassified, in 11 pages filed with the Suffolk County Probate Court, as Griffin's inheritance. Then I went to my study, sat at my desk, and began to make a list. Not of grievances. A list of questions, the way I had been trained as an archivist, precise, in order, sourced. What did I know? What did I need to find out? What was documented and where? The questions fell into 3 categories. First, the signature. Second, Edward's capacity at the time of signing. Third, who had been in that room, and when, and whether anyone besides Griffin and his attorney could account for the 11 days before the document was executed. I had spent 24 years living in a house full of records. Edward kept everything: correspondence, receipts, architectural drawings, medical files. He was a man who believed that the paper outlasted the memory, and he had organized his life accordingly. I knew where everything was. Griffin did not. I began to read. Margaret, the day nurse, was the first person I called. I asked her if she would be willing to speak with my attorney. She said yes without hesitating, and what she said to me before she got off the phone I have carried with me since. She said, "Mrs. Aldcroft, in my last week with Mr. Aldcroft, there were days he didn't know what month it was. There were days he thought he was in the Vermont house. On the day those people came with the papers, I was sent to the kitchen. I thought that was strange. I've thought about it since. Those people. Griffin and Sylvia Prentice, his attorney. They had come with the papers on a day when Margaret had been present, and they had sent her to the kitchen. My attorney was a woman named Constance Farwell, recommended by Harold, who specialized in will contests and spoke about undue influence the way Edward had spoken about load-bearing walls, with the patience of someone who has spent decades understanding exactly how much pressure a structure can bear before it fails. Constance filed a will contest in the Suffolk County Probate Court within 3 weeks of our first meeting. The grounds were 2, lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence. Both required documentation. Both, Constance told me, were winnable, if the records said what I believed they said. The records said exactly what I believed they said. Edward's oncologist produced notes from the final month of his life, documenting significant cognitive decline secondary to disease progression and medication. The hospice intake assessment, completed the week before the new will was signed, described Edward as intermittently oriented to person only, meaning there were stretches of those final days when he did not reliably know where he was or what was happening around him. A man who does not reliably know where he is cannot reliably understand the document he is signing. This is not a moral argument. It is a legal standard, and the records met it. The signature was the second pillar, and it was the one that moved me most, not legally but personally, because it was the place where the document showed its hand most clearly. Constance retained a forensic document examiner, a woman who had spent 30 years analyzing handwriting for courts across New England, and gave her 2 things: the signature on the new will and a collection of Edward's authenticated signatures from the previous 5 years, drawn from tax documents, architectural contracts, and correspondence Harold had kept in his files. The examiner's report was 12 pages. The conclusion was 3 sentences. The signature on the document of November 3 shows significant deviation from the subject's established signature characteristics, consistent with signing under physical duress, severe motor impairment, or cognitive impairment affecting voluntary motor control. The letter formation, pressure distribution, and spatial orientation are inconsistent with authenticated samples across all years examined. In my professional opinion, this signature does not reliably represent the free and voluntary act of the subject. In my professional opinion, this signature does not reliably represent the free and voluntary act of the subject. I read that sentence in Constance's office, and the cold clarity I had been carrying for 3 months became something else, something older and sadder and more certain. Edward had not written that signature. Or if he had not known what he was writing. Either way, the document did not represent him. It represented the people who had brought it to his bedside and put a pen in a dying man's hand and walked away with an estate. I want to be honest about Griffin because honesty is the only currency I have left that feels clean. Griffin Aldcroft was not a villain in the way of movies. He was a complicated man who had grown up without his father and had spent his adult life in the long shadow of an inheritance he believed was his by right and had watched, for 24 years, being shared with a woman he had never fully accepted. He had convinced himself, I think, that what he did was correction rather than theft, that he was restoring something to its proper order, that I was the interloper and he was simply reclaiming what was his. That is not a defense. It is an explanation, and the law does not accept explanations where it requires standards. Constance deposed Griffin in January. He was composed and careful, the way he always was, and he said that his father had expressed, in those final weeks, a desire to ensure Griffin's security, that Edward had been clear and present on the day the document was signed, that he had asked for the changes himself. Constance asked him whether Harold Birch had been present. Griffin said Harold had not been available. Constance asked whether Griffin had attempted to contact Harold. A pause. Then, it had not seemed necessary. Constance set down her pen and looked at Griffin for a moment, just a moment, and then asked her next question. But that pause was the answer. A man who genuinely believed his father was making a free and informed decision does not fail to call the attorney who had handled that man's estate for 40 years. A man who is managing a situation does. Griffin knew exactly what he had done. The deposition made that clear without anyone having to say it. Constance had always believed the case would settle before trial, and she was right. Estate litigation is expensive, slow, and public in a way that benefits no one who has a reputation to protect, and Griffin had a reputation, a finance career in New York, a family of his own. A social world in which the story of how he had handled his father's estate could circulate and do damage. The mediation was held in February, in a conference room in a building on Federal Street, with a retired judge named Rosenstein presiding and the kind of institutional quiet that settles over rooms where large amounts of money are being decided. Griffin came with Sylvia Prentice and 2 associates. I came with Constance and Harold, who had asked to be present as a witness to Edward's original intentions and whose presence in that room, I think, said something to Griffin that nothing else could, that the people who had known Edward longest believed what I believed. I had decided, before I walked into that room, what I was and was not willing to accept. Not out of greed, I want to be precise about that, but out of something more specific. The Beacon Hill house was not a financial asset to me. It was the place where Edward and I had lived 24 years of a real marriage. It was the plasterwork he had restored with his own hands, and the garden we had planned on graph paper, and the ground floor bedroom where I had held his hand at the end. I was not willing to accept $200,000 and a box of jewelry in exchange for that. I was not willing to let the word companionship be the last word on what we had been to each other. The mediation lasted 7 hours. I will not tell you every turn of it because some of it belongs to the room where it happened. What I will tell you is that by the end of those 7 hours, with Rosenstein's careful management and Constance's even steadier one, we reached a settlement that the original will would have recognized. The Beacon Hill house came to me. The Vermont property was sold and the proceeds split equally between me and Griffin. The investment portfolio was divided according to the terms of the 2018 will, the one Edward and I had made together at the kitchen table with Harold and 2 cups of coffee. The $200,000 and the word companionship were removed from the record as if they had never been written, which in the only sense that mattered to me, they had not. Griffin signed without looking at me. I did not need him to look at me. The document said what it said. I went back to the Beacon Hill house that evening and walked through it again, the way I had the night I came home from Harold's first meeting, but differently this time. Not tallying. Just being in it. The plasterwork in the front hall that Edward had spent 3 weeks restoring in 2003 because the original craftsman's technique mattered to him. The kitchen table where we had made decisions together for 2 decades. The garden outside the ground floor bedroom window, still dormant in February, waiting for the spring the way gardens always do, patient and certain and indifferent to the things that happen inside the house. Edward had been right about buildings as memory. A well-made structure holds the people who lived inside it. I could feel him in every room, Not as grief exactly, more as presence, the particular, specific presence of a man I had known completely. And who had known me, and who had, in his right mind and with his full self, chosen to build something with me that lasted. What Griffin had tried to take was not just property. It was the official record of what Edward and I had been. The document he had put in front of a dying man said that I had been a companion, useful, temporary, compensated, and released. The settlement said something different. It said what Edward had always said, in every version of his will until the one that was not really his, that I was his wife, that what we had built was ours, and that the record would reflect that. The record reflected that. I still live in the Beacon Hill house. I have restored 2 more sections of the original plasterwork, because that is the kind of thing you do when a house is yours and you intend to keep it honest. The garden came back in April, the way it always does, and I sat on the back step in the early morning with coffee and watched it and thought about patience. The patience of gardens, the patience of records, the patience required to hold a grief and a fight at the same time without letting either one destroy the other. I have been asked since whether I am angry at Griffin. The honest answer is that I passed through anger a long time ago and came out somewhere quieter. What Griffin did was wrong. It was a wrong done to his father as much as to me, using a dying man's helplessness as an instrument, reducing the last weeks of a long and considered life to a transaction. He will have to carry that. I do not need to carry it for him. What I carry is simpler. The knowledge that I showed up for Edward, for the marriage, for the record. That when someone tried to rewrite the last chapter of 24 years, I did not accept the rewriting. That the document, in the end, said what was true. Edward always said that a well-made structure holds the people who lived inside it long after they are gone. I think he was right. I think he knew, somewhere in the part of him that was still entirely himself, that the house would hold us both, his work and my tenancy and the long quiet life we had made inside those walls. Regardless of what anyone tried to file in a probate court in November. The house knows what it is. So do I. My name is Vivienne Aldcroft. I was 52 years old when someone tried to erase 24 years of my marriage with 11 pages and a shaky signature. I was 53 when the record was corrected. If this story reminded you to keep your own documents honest, update your will, sit down with your attorney, have the real conversation with the people you love before someone else has it for you, do it this week. Not because the world is full of Griffins, but because the people you love deserve the record you actually intend, not the one someone else writes in the room when you are no longer able to speak for yourself. That is the quietest, most important thing I know. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs it, and I will see you in the next one.